Our second scripture reading this morning comes from the 9th chapter of John's Gospel. Listen now for what the Spirit is saying to us. As Jesus walked along, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." When he said this, he spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva and spread the mud on the man's eyes, saying to him, "Go, wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. Then he went and washed and came back able to see. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar began to ask, "Is this not the man who used to sit and beg?" Some were saying, "It is he." Others were saying, "No, but it is someone like him." He kept saying, "I am he." But they kept saying, "Then how were your eyes opened?" He answered, "The man called Jesus made mud, spread it on my eyes, and said to me, 'Go to Siloam and wash.' Then I went and washed and received my sight." They said to him, "Where is he?" He said, "I do not know." They brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. Then the Pharisees also began to ask him how he had received his sight. He said to them, "He put mud on my eyes, then I washed, and now I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God, for he does not observe the Sabbath." Others said, "How can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?" And they were divided. So they said again to the blind man, "What do you say about him? It was your eyes he opened." He said, "He is a prophet." The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight and asked him, "Is this your son who you say was born blind? Then how does he now see?" His parents answered, "We know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but we do not know how it is now he sees, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He is of age. He can speak for himself." His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that anyone who confessed Jesus to be the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, "He is of age. Ask him." So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind, and they said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." He answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" And then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here is an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Some of you may know this about me already, but I'm a self-proclaimed superfan of the TV show Survivor. I've seen every episode that's ever aired, and I'm currently enjoying the 44th season of the show. It began airing all the way back in the spring of 2000. If you aren't familiar with the show, its general premise is to take 18 strangers, place them on an island in which they must attempt to survive on very meager, if any, supplies and develop a society. Along the way, they're required to vote out members of their tribe on the way to crowning the sole survivor and the winner of $1 million. To win the title of sole survivor and the prize money, you need to outwit, outlast, and outplay the other players. One of the more interesting parts of every season is around the first few days. Members of each tribe spend time sizing each other up. And throughout the first couple of days, people make assumptions about other players based on how they look, things they say, and what they do. Sometimes a player will wander off to look for water or a food source, and other players will assume that they're working against the rest of the tribe. Oftentimes, these assumptions end up with people being voted off the island for something someone has assumed, not something they've actually done. One of the best examples of this was Francesca. Her first time on the show was on season 22. And if you haven't finished the season from 2011, spoiler alert, she doesn't win. In the first episode of the season, other players start talking about how Francesca seems like a threat in the game. They assume she'll be crafty because she's a lawyer. And other players start talking about how if they don't vote her out early, she'll definitely win the game. Mind you, these players met each other for the first time about 36 hours prior. And then, at the first, Survivor later brought her back for another season where the exact same thing happened, and she was voted out first again. Since it was only the first 3 days on the island, how could anyone know anything for sure? The other players made assumptions, and they acted on them. The same is true for the disciples in our passage today. They make an assumption about this blind man. They assume that his blindness is a result of sin. And in the ancient world, disabilities and pain of any kind were thought of to be a direct result of sin. They had no other explanations for them. In some ways, our current culture hasn't moved beyond that too well. We often assume people have created the situations they're in. We assume people are poor because they haven't managed their money well. We assume people who work don't have any skills. We assume people who don't speak English with our exact same accent don't know what they're talking about. But Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus sees this blind man, and Jesus does what Jesus does best. He turns the world upside down. In the interaction with the woman at the well that Megan preached on last week and the blind man in our passage today, Jesus speaks directly to them, despite both of these people being marginalized by their society. It's worth reminding ourselves over and over again that Jesus doesn't want to spend time exclusively with the disciples and the religious leaders. He wants to meet with the marginalized, and he meets them where they are. Jesus wants his glory to shine through those the world has deemed separate. Jesus doesn't wait for the blind man to approach him and ask to be healed. He doesn't wait for this man to come to his church so he can help him. I find it interesting that this man has no name in this whole account. It's clear he's been a member of this community, and while he likely has been on the outs because of his disability, I'm still surprised no one knows his name and no one cares to ask it. You may have missed this as I read the passage earlier. I did the first time I read it. After the man's sight is restored, his neighbors and those who had seen him before don't recognize him. It seems to me that this community has paid such little attention to this man, they couldn't pick him out of a crowd. And even after the man says, "I am he," they still don't appear to be satisfied with his answer. Even after this man can see his community, they still can't see him. Over the summer, I traveled to Nashville with a group of our young people for a service learning immersion trip. As part of the experience, we participated in an urban plunge. Our youth spent the morning preparing extra lunches, and then they went out on the streets of downtown Nashville to ask anyone they encountered questions about life in Nashville. All of our youth met and talked with people working in the area and people that describe themselves as home free instead of homeless. One of our groups met with a man named Devin, and Devin had been through a lot of adversity that led him to the Nashville streets. It would have been easy to walk down the street and assume that Devin just wanted some money to get drunk or to get high. But instead, one of our youth, Emily, took some time to sit down and listen to what Devin had to say. Emily saw Devin as a human being, someone in need of a little extra help. After a little bit of talking and sharing bits and pieces of their stories with each other, Emily asked Devin what he needed, and he simply replied that he could. So Emily took the socks off of her own feet and handed them over to Devin. This is what it means to see the humanity, to move beyond assumptions and see a human being created in the image of God. That's exactly what the disciples and the religious leaders seem to miss of the power of Jesus. The man without sight sees clearly that Jesus is the Son of God, God with us, Emmanuel. Yet the religious leaders have written him off. They've assumed that he can't know anything of God because he must be a sinner. Yet it's through this man that the glory of Jesus is shown. The religious leaders have decided this man doesn't know his own experience. They refuse to believe them because it doesn't fit their story. It doesn't fit their narrative. It doesn't fit their assumptions. And it's clear that God is working in this man, yet the religious leaders refuse to believe. But Jesus stops making assumptions. Jesus welcomes this man and restores him to good standing in his community. When the man who was born blind is asked how he was healed for the third time, he asks the religious leaders if they would like to become disciples of Jesus. They once again write him off as if he has no business knowing anything. They can't imagine that this man could know anything about the Messiah that they are waiting for. These religious leaders have devoted their lives to waiting and helping others prepare for the coming Messiah, and when he appears in front of them and does miraculous things, they don't believe. They don't believe that this blind man can teach them anything. They believe there's nothing they can learn from this man who was blind, cast out, and marginalized by society. But that's not how Jesus works. That's not who our God is. Our God is not a God of assumptions. Our God is a God who not only welcomes, but celebrates those separated from society. So what should we do about it? Well, let's follow the lead of Emily and our young people. Let's go out from this place to meet the marginalized. Let yourself be led by the Spirit and open your mind so that you can learn something from someone who doesn't look like you, who doesn't make money like you do, who doesn't go to church like you do, who doesn't vote like you, who doesn't see the world like you do. Because that's what Jesus would do. And this world will benefit so much from it looking a little bit more like Jesus. Thanks be to God.